All right. Welcome everybody to class number 7, I think, of the Organizing the Green New Deal course. Today we have a really awesome guest speaker who is in the thick of it in Congress right now. His name is Saul Levin, and he is a staffer, climate and energy and labor staffer for Representative Cori Bush, exciting new Congresswoman, and formerly worked with Deb Haaland, who's now the Secretary of the Interior after a surprisingly quick confirmation, actually, from my perspective at least. I'm going to pass it over to you, Saul, and you're going to tell us about federal climate policy before 2022. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick. Let me just get my screen share going here. All right, can you see that? Amazing. Hey, everybody. Really happy to be here with you today. My name is Saul. I use he, him pronouns. Yeah, as Nick mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about federal climate policy. I used to do presentations where I would hold myself to 6 slides. This one's a little bit more, but I'm going to try and keep the presentation pretty brief to see which kind of direction folks want to go with questions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, specific like what federal climate policies are kind of happening right now, but also about, I think there's like a real problem with transparency and accessibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some things that you might want to know just to sort of know what's happening. A little bit about what I was doing before. I did work for Congresswoman Deb Haaland. I did a lot of climate organizing and just transition research and was organizing renewable and efficiency projects. I mentioned people just ask a lot sort of what kind of path leads you into Congress. And I first started as a fellow with Congresswoman Haaland through graduate school. Obviously, now I work for Congresswoman Cori Bush. Major disclaimer, I'm not speaking on her behalf today. These are my own views, my personal time, but really excited to be here with you and talk a little bit about what's going on in Congress. Okay, so this stuff is a little bit boring in some ways, but I think like this is really useful stuff to just kind of say at the top. So in terms of terminology, I think there's there's a lot of terms that float around. And there's a few that I think there's many that you really won't care about, but there's a few that I think are kind of useful. In Congress, co-sponsorship basically means that someone signs onto a bill before a vote has happened. And so you've probably heard people talk about, oh, I co-sponsored this bill. It means they signed on earlier. Original co-sponsorship is when you signed on before the bill was introduced or reintroduced. And then endorsements usually are more about organizations signing on in support. The reason that I wanted to bring this up is that I think like having fluidity with knowing those very basic things gives you like a real leg up in terms of understanding what's happening in Congress, and it's relevant because your ask is for someone to co-sponsor something before they can, if you're advocating for something before you're asking them to vote for it, because it probably hasn't come up for a vote yet. And these kind of deadlines are created such that there's like certain moments where advocacy, like you have extra power to rush someone if they could have the chance to be an original co-sponsor versus not. In terms of other terminology, well, we can open it up later if people have specific questions. I get a lot of questions from folks who are like applying for jobs on Capitol Hill or want to work in climate policy about committees and caucuses. The most useful way that I've heard and that I try and talk about it is basically that committees are like majors in college and minors, and then caucuses are like clubs. So there's a caucus for pretty much everything. Like you really can't tell by the name whether they meet every week or whether they haven't met in 3 years. Like it's just not very obvious. but they're sort of like things that you can participate in, and some of them do like really important work and really move the needle the same way college clubs do. Whereas committees are kind of like, those are the classes you actually have to show up for. Like that's the ones where, I spend a lot of time figuring out like, what is, talking to the congresswoman and being like, what is she going to say today? Blah, blah, blah. But I think that can sort of also give you a sense of where you have leverage, because like people have power and, influence and interest based on what committees they're on. In terms of office structure, I think sometimes people don't really know um, this, and I don't know why you would, but I think it's really helpful to understand as you're thinking about advocacy, and if you're like want to be a champion for the climate cause and like pushing climate policy further than it is, because obviously Congress is not at the forefront of what needs to be happening. Um, excuse my siren. The policy shop in a congressional office, in most congressional offices, is like 3 or 4 people in DC. There's a legislative director and then legislative assistants, and between those people, maybe a legislative aide or correspondent or something, policy advisor. These things all mean like different versions of seniority, but usually there's about 3 people, and those 3 people split up every issue area. So like when Congresswoman Bush votes on agriculture, environment, energy, Native American sovereignty, labor, trade, workforce, small business, commerce, transportation, public works, postal service. Those are all votes where I have to make the recommendation on what she covers. And so it's important to understand that like there are a lot of staffers in Congress who ended up with the environmental portfolio and like really don't have a deep background in climate organizing, but they're still like the main person kind of covering that. And it's the same for any other issue. And so as you're thinking about how you're interacting with an office, like this person might have been working on these issues and gotten passionate about them for a long time. They might have been like me, where they came out of the climate EJ world, and they might be someone who like got hired because of their chops on Medicare for all, and they like are like looking to direction from groups on what they should even do. And I think that's just a really important point of reference. Then of course there's a communications team. Ours is amazing, by the way, in Congresswoman Bush's office. Operations is like the scheduling team, the folks who make it all happen, and all kinds of things about flags and tours and managing other folks, and like basically nothing would happen without them. And then like about half the staff are in the district and doing community engagement work, direct constituent services, etc. So again, like a little bit of boring stuff about Congress, but if you want to influence congressional policy, like knowing that someone has to be covering between 10 and 20 issue areas is like a fundamentally important thing that like most people I talk to, it turns out, don't know. And I mean, I frankly didn't know either until I started doing it and was like, yeah, now I know a lot about the Postal Service. Who would have thought? Okay, let's see. So yeah, so I think I find it really annoying in climate presentations, and people are like, well, what's climate related? And they put up like a wind turbine or like a JPEG of a solar panel. And I find it really depressing. But I've been on this like whole tip about Greenland sharks, which are like the longest lived vertebrates. They can live like up to 500 years. Their gestation period is 8 to 18 years. Anyways, you should read about them, but I just put a few in here because like you're not going to get much out of a picture of a wind turbine if we're being honest. So climate policy in Congress, I basically wanted to like lay out a little bit. Committees are much more central importance in the House than they are in the Senate. And so I'll talk about the House. Basically there's the Natural Resources Committee, and then there's the Energy and Commerce Committee, are like the two main committees where like a lot of the policy on these happen. There's some that happens on the Science and Technology Committee where like research and development happens. And of the Appropriations Committee, which like appropriates or takes like decides the spending of how Congress spends, also has an environmental section. So again, like a little bit of sort of basic stuff, but like this is like figuring out if your member of Congress is on one of these committees is like a very useful thing to know. The range among Democrats, my God, like, all right, well, we'll come back to this actually. The progressive space of climate policy in Congress is the main thing I want to flag here is that like this is a totally exciting time, and really like it's thanks to movements that we're in a really important moment where we're going to be able to have a big impact on this like really important climate moment that's happening right now, because like we have not only Congresswoman Bush and the rest of the squad, but there are like a bunch of members of Congress you've never heard of who like vote almost identically to the squad and have really good politics, or maybe not quite as, progressive as the squad, but like there's a body of folks who like have good politics in Congress now, folks. Like that wasn't a big thing and then recent past. And so that's really fun. And I think like, knowing who some of these folks with great politics are is something that's useful. And you'll see their names crop up again and again. Um, but yeah, like sometimes I joke about it because a lot of them are like in their 60s and like get a lot less attention, but they're just like were recently elected in the past 2 to 6 years and just like do amazing stuff. Um, so okay, so the let's see, progressive space. Oh, telling bills apart. Bill, like, how do you get anyone to care about a bill in Congress, right? Like, they can go look it up on congress.gov, but like, really, who cares? Are you actually going to read through that? Like, well, I mean, obviously I care, but most people don't care that much. And like, there's like a ton of bills that are like the climate justice bill or, the Transportation for All and Justice Act. And it's just like, I really encourage folks to like read a little bit beyond the description, because a lot of bills in Congress, just the nature of how it goes, like have these really generalizable names or generalized names and like do one really specific thing where they force like one, undersecretary of something to like have one program that's like $3,000 type of, it's just like really specific. So just to flag that. Okay, so that was a lot of like pretty boring congressional context, but I think like my hope is that some of y'all can be involved in policy making. Some of y'all probably already are, and I find like a lot of people who are trying to get things done on Capitol Hill like don't know some of the things that I just said, even ones who have been there for a while. Some of them it's more obvious, but here are some of the main climate and EJ debates. And by the way, like the first one is market solutions and carbon pricing, and like how much do we want to focus on like, having a cap and trade situation, or how much do we want to, whatever. Um, those are sort of the solutions preferred by like the center of the Democratic Party and increasingly the Republican Party. Um, a lot of us are not super thrilled on those, but I won't even talk about those now. I want to talk a little bit more about like what are some of the ruptures like in the more progressive part of the Democratic Party. Um, so false solutions, you can see what my orientation is on this issue. I already gave it away, but I think like there's a lot of things about, direct air capture and carbon capture and storage. And, there's geoengineering, which isn't super popular and no one in Congress truthfully is really promoting doing that right now. Um, but, these are some basic ideas about how to reduce the emissions of fossil fuels, as opposed to some other ideas of sort of cutting off their supply, like procuring and installing solar and wind power and like shutting down pipelines. And there's a lot of debates um, about how that comes together. And I really, what I wanted, the reason I want to bring this up to you all is I think, and I'm happy to share this afterwards, but there's like a really problematic McKinsey study that like really captures in my mind what I'm talking about here. So the study says like with current market forces, we're going to get to 50 to 60% renewable energy with no public investment, which like ignores why solar panels are cheaper, which is public investment, some of it in China, not here, but anyways. Um, and it also just like isn't true. Like there's nothing to suggest that that's going to happen in the time frame we need. And then from there, they say, because the 60% to 50 to 60% is guaranteed, like those of us who are really technocratic and like really have like to take on puzzles are focused on the hard questions about carbon capture and storage and like so on and so forth. And here's the problem with that. It's possible that there's a time that's going to come where we need, it is true that it's like very hard to figure out how to balance all inconsistent renewable power on a grid. But people are avoiding the question right now, which is that like we need to install renewable power until we've really hit up against that, and then we can solve the puzzle. And so I think that's one of the main debates, is like how soft or how hard to be on some of these false solutions. Um, or maybe not totally false solutions, but solutions that don't fully cut off the supply of fossil fuels. I have supply side written in here. That's a big question. Like, do we want to focus on like investing in um, renewable energy and like creating tons of jobs like in the process? Or some folks are like, if we do that, we're not actually going to end US production of fossil fuels, they're going to be exported. And I think like those are basically both true. I'm happy to discuss more in Q&A. EJ and Indigenous sovereignty questions, there are tons of bills in Congress that are like pretty interesting on energy and just have nothing about the fact that like coal is by and large burned in Black communities, nothing about the fact that like pipelines are like a direct threat to Indigenous sovereignty every day, and like basic rights of people who have already suffered the most and faced mass genocide in this country. And like people, it's like have an easy time ignoring that. So the extent to which those provisions are included and those like frontline communities can actually have a say in like what they actually want and how they're going to be getting money, etc. Then labor questions, of course, like it's extremely difficult to figure out, it genuinely is, what we're going to do about the fact that a lot of people have good paying jobs in the fossil fuel industry. And workers get screwed over at every turn in this country. And so like just saying, oh, well, we're going to put workers first, like isn't really sufficient. But I think like, eco-socialists and progressives have done an increasingly good job of saying like, hey, like, basically massive corporations have consistently tried to set these groups against each other. And like what we want is liberation for all people. And what we want is a decarbonized future where everyone has a good job. And like, we need to just do the research and the strategy and public investment to make that a reality. In terms of the coming moment, again, like depending on what folks have questions on, we can talk about this more or less. But the reason I say this is an important moment is like, you've heard this a million times, right? Like Democrats have both chambers of chambers of Congress, and that, Democrats we have the presidency. Look, y'all, like we don't really know what's going to happen right now. Biden is supposed to give his first big speech on Build Back Better next week. There's a handful of bills that I'm happy to discuss more from moderates that are extremely comprehensive, that have committee backing, that have some good stuff and some really not great stuff, and generally lack in the scale of ambition that's needed for this moment. But what's really exciting is that, this bullet here about like Thrive and this, a growing progressive package of like the best climate infrastructure bills in the Progressive Caucus, like there's a real beehive starting to swarm on the left, to the left of Biden, which hasn't reached the media yet, but like a lot of us are like working all hours trying to demand something better, to demand more funding, to demand more frontline investments, to demand a higher percentage of this goes into climate funding, not just general infrastructure funding. And it's a really exciting time because like this is our fucking moment, and like we're trying to take it because that's this, we use what we have and try and win it. The reconciliation piece is like more of a technicality about how like different pieces of this are going to be discussed. I'm happy to talk about it more, but I'll just kind of skip over that now because not that important for this conversation necessarily. Okay, what works? So I just wanted to spend like a second talking about, people ask me all the time, like, does it actually work if I call my member of Congress and like ask them to support a bill? The answer is yes. I mean, of course, it depends how responsive your member of Congress is. Um, you know, like Congresswoman Bush has like this unbelievable reputation because like every single thing that's followed up on, like that's not always necessarily true, but I think like by and large, like members of Congress are actually pretty good at tracking calls and like keeping track of this stuff. But like people are going to ask you what your zip code is, and this is pretty obvious to most folks. Like, yeah, it really helps to call the person whose district I live in. that's true. It also really helps to like talk about a specific piece of legislation and have some research behind you of like, okay, this is a good bill. This is a moment when they might actually support it because they'll see it as a priority because, this is their chance to be an original co-sponsor or whatever. And the other thing I think, like, this is the thing that's like most helpful, if you're an advocate, is to think about like, if you were covering climate for Cory Bush, what are the things you would need to know to like make a quick decision about whether you were going to recommend support for a bill or not? And the answer is like a very brief summary of it, like where can I get more facts about it, and then like, or like flagging which sections of the text are really good, um or really exciting, like what is the part of this bill that motivated you to like spend your evening like sending this email or sending this blast, um and like some basic details of like who else has signed on. If similar members of Congress have signed on, that makes it easier. Which organizations are endorsing, like people will see ones that they work with and they can call their someone they work with at that organization quickly and ask if do you think this is kosher too. um so that's all, happy to discuss that more. I don't know how in terms of like who's listening, how interested folks are in that, but I think like there are some really basic things that you can do that make like an ask to sign on to, everything from the Green New Deal to like a more niche piece of legislation, like much more effective, um, to try and get your congressperson to do what you want. So anyways, I'll stop there. Really, really excited to be here. Really grateful for the work that Breach Collective and Power Shift Network are doing. And really excited to hear any questions that folks have. Ask me literally anything you want and we'll see what happens. But thanks again. And you can DM me on Twitter if you have questions after this, because if we're being honest with my inbox, that might be the fastest way.
Thanks for that great presentation, Saul. There's a couple things while we wait for audience questions to come in. I'm going to take moderator privileges and ask a couple here, but you mentioned some dynamics in the context of a McKinsey study where you kind of were talking about kind of like technocratic solutions to problems. And then you had mentioned in passing kind of like the reconciliation issue, which I would love you to explain a little bit more to folks. I know it's on the other side of the aisle, but I sort of see these as like two different strategies of power more than necessarily the policy pieces. Is it, can we expect, let's put it this way, how do we get our Democratic Congress people and ultimately President Biden to exercise power where they can, rather than kind of like what we've seen in past Democratic presidencies where it's just like, well, can't really push. We like try to negotiate and the other side was mean, and what are we supposed to do about it?
Yeah. So here's something that I also wanted to mention that partially answers your question, which is that there's a moment when a member of Congress introduces a bill where the staffer, people on staff, organizations who had input on the bill in some way have like a blitz and they try and get as many members of Congress signed on as possible. And they try and get as many organizations to endorse as possible and as many media hits or whatever as possible. Like, people know this. But then it stops. Like the norm in Congress is like, there's so many things happening. There's so many people asking you to do so many things. Like there are many bills in Congress right now that are really good that people just don't know about. And they haven't been growing in terms of co-sponsorship. Like if we just had like a handful of folks who were just like continuing on going and like getting their friends together and saying, let's all call our representative about these bills, that would be really powerful. Because I think to your question, Nick, like in this moment, we don't have time to like start new bills from scratch and try and get them in the coming infrastructure climate package. We're definitely going to try and do that anyways. But if we're being honest, like that's not how fast a bill happens. If you actually want to have like genuine community input on your legislation. And so we're going to keep trying to do that. But like the moment we have right now and the way to get taken seriously is to take a bill from having, 15 members of Congress sign on to be like, hey, there's 140 members of Congress signed on to this bill. Like actually ending fossil fuel subsidies is like a profoundly reasonable thing to do. And like the comprehensive bill to end fossil fuel subsidies is called the End Polluter Welfare Act. It's a Sanders Omar bill. It's incredible because it has a section that says also there's a mandate to look for more fossil fuel subsidies and eliminate them. So it's like extremely comprehensive and well done. And so, I highly recommend everyone call your congressperson and ask them to sign on to that bill, for example, as like a human being on earth. I recommend it.
And kind of following that up, what are some of the, you mentioned some really exciting bills that could do a lot. What are the things that you're most excited about as somebody who is close to this?
Yeah. So,
And Vanessa's also in the chat is saying, give us a list of bills. So
yes. Well, so we're organizing an effort right now where we're finding all of the best bills in Congress, and we're just going to start sharing them around and be like, this is the counterweight to these moderate packages. Like, these are the best bills in Congress that we have right now. We know that they're not perfectly comprehensive. Look, like a lot of the progressives have recently gotten elected. Like a lot of the ones who were recently elected have already put out good stuff. And we, um, yeah, the thing I'm most excited about by far is that we're basically like the strategy that I'm telling you is something that we're very actively doing. And like, I think one of the cool things about Congresswoman Cori Bush is that she's an activist. So the fact that, I told her like, I can't get arrested with you because I still have to pay a plea deal right now was like a positive for her is like really cool in terms of like she's on board with this strategy of like we're lifting all ships. Like we don't have a problem asking someone else to endorse Ilhan Omar's bill, even though that's like the non-normal thing. So I think what I'm really excited about is that we're building this coalition um, to support to like be a backstop, right? Like there's really good things happening. The Progressive Caucus is going to be making really good demands. There's the Thrive agenda, which has like really been elevating the conversation on environmental justice in a way, like for a lot of members of Congress who hadn't been focused on it as well. And like what we're kind of contributing right now is we're like tracking down the specifics and saying like this is the shit that you want to call your congressperson and ask them to sign on to, and like go to congress.gov, like that's where it's going to say if they're already signed on to it. So I'm really excited about that because I think like the best case scenario is some of that becomes law as part of this coming moment. And the worst case scenario is that all of these progressive bills have more and more co-sponsors till they become the Democratic Party norm, and we can leave them market solutions that we know don't work to Republicans.
great. Couple questions about nuts and bolts of lobbying congressmen and women. So Iron Rot, I think Iron Rot says, can you go into greater detail about how to lobby your congressperson? Is it necessary to present an argument for a bill over the phone? And another person asks, if we're introverts and terrified, like, are people actually reading letters? Did people check Twitter mentions? What are the ways that you can get eyes on comments?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I know, like, this is not, yeah, I love this because it's just like, we want this to be successful. And like, hopefully, if you're connected to Power Shift Network and Breach Collective, like, I'm sharing this in the right place. So basically, like, yes, people, it depends. Like, there are members of there, the whole thing came out at one point that like Mitt Romney reads all the comments on his Twitter or whatever, right? But like, I don't think that's really the norm. But like, yes, every single letter gets like, so there are people who look at every single letter. And um, I think the answer to the argument question or people being afraid on the phone, like the answer, like where you can have a lot of impact is volume. Because like even if one staffer reads your letter carefully, like they still have to read all these others and figure out a way to respond to all of them. And so like even if you've written a really compelling letter, that's really good. And like, at least our office, like we're gonna actually read your letter. However, if you can get 10 friends to write a letter and it's like it really because there's also tracking like numbers wise. And so if you had like 15 friends in a district send a postcard saying like please, co-sponsor the End Polluter Welfare Act. Like I live in, you know, this neighborhood and like it would mean a lot to my community. Done. Like that's a really powerful thing. So I think numbers are really powerful. Social media is powerful, but I mean, like, it kind of varies, right? I mean, first of all, like, imagine how many trolls there are telling Congress people to go to hell on every one of their Twitter posts. So, like, they shouldn't be reading it for their own mental health, even if they are, like, to be perfectly honest. Um, but then, like, a lot of folks, like, we there as far as I know, I mean, actually our social media team probably does read all the comments on Congresswoman Bush's Twitter. I literally don't even know, but they're like very responsive. And we definitely read as many as we can. I think they read all of them. I don't even know, but how that works. But I think like that specifically um, can be positive. But I would say like if I were you, I would focus on volume and I wouldn't be discouraged about being an introvert. Just like find the way that works for you and get your congressperson to sign on.
Great. There's a question from Heather in the chat. Statement first, and then it gets to a question. I think those of us who juggle systems change versus incrementalism wonder whether well-intentioned moderate Democrats, as well as typical big Greens, are actually bigger impediment to decisive progressive action than the Republicans are in terms of how much time they take up, et cetera. Curious about Saul's perspective on that from a congressional standpoint. Oh, you're on mute, Saul.
Oh, well, I wasn't saying any, I'm not sure I understood the question. So the question is like, how do big greens sort of fit into this conversation and like the different counterweights?
I think the question is more about, is the sort of like status quo moderate center serving as more of an obstacle than the Republicans are? I think that's kind of the thrust of the question. And how do you see those dynamics functioning? I guess it's like an Overton window kind of question.
Yeah. So look, y'all, like I've definitely been like yelled at by plenty of like, or got, had like moderates and Republicans get mad at me and progressives about wanting, just the way that anything works. But I think like my analysis of that is like, we're asking too much of that question at the outset. Like, I think that's a really important question, but it's an important question after progressives have planted like an equivalently large and comprehensive flag as a negotiation starting point. So I think to the degree to which like are moderates a bigger impediment? I mean, I don't really like no, I don't think so because like I mean, look at what Republicans are doing. I mean, come on, like in basic terms. But I think the reason the question is important is like who do we have to lobby and who do we have to win over? And when I talk to like much more certainly not eco-socialist like me, members of, staffers in Congress and stuff, a lot of times they're like, what on earth do you guys even think about this stuff? Like we have no idea what the hell you guys are going on about like why do you guys hate carbon capture? Why are you guys like, there's like uncertainty about EJ sometimes. There's just like a misunderstanding even in terms of like where are you guys even negotiating from? Because I think there hasn't been like these kinds of lists and comprehensive things to flesh out, the really good things like the Green New Deal to say like this is where we stand. There's been a lot of really important work on that, but I think we need even more. And then we kind of plant like this is where we're at, this is where you're at now. Like we can compromise, right? Like compromise isn't a fundamentally bad thing. The problem with compromise is we do it before we introduce the bill, and so it's like super milk toasty a lot of the time.
Do you think some of that dynamic of Congress people not knowing what people are even talking about, do you think that has to do with kind of the left sort of being in its own echo chamber a little bit too much and not actually doing enough of the on the ground lobbying and communication with the people that need to kind of hear that? Or do you think it's more like not listening from the perspective of the congressperson?
Well, so I'm actually talking more about staff in this case. I think it's funny. This is one case where I think like moderate Congress people might know a bit more because it like progressives have clear demands on campaigns. But I think no, I think from staffers it's like they want to know where we're starting from in this negotiation. And it's like we can get past the fact that we don't like what each other are saying. but like we need to be like, okay, this is what we want and why, and then we can talk about, like, I've talked to moderate staffers who are like, hey man, like we're actually, I'm a good Democrat in the sense that I'm willing to just keep adding more spending. So if you had told me that like you didn't like this part, but if I put a ton more like work, training for, solar work or whatever into this, then you would have been on board. Like I had no idea, but I like would have just added money for anything. I just wanted to keep this thing in. And it was like, oh, we should have like had a beer before. Like, what are we doing? So I think, uh, yeah, hopefully that partially answers the question.
Awesome. There's a question from Michael in the chat about the DSA, or not the DSA sponsor, but the PRO Act that's being pushed really hard by Democratic Socialists of America. Well, I'll just say, like, are you following that close? And what's going on? It's in the Senate now, right?
Yes. I mean, what's the question about the PRO Act? We love the PRO Act. It like truly is transformative legislation. The nitty gritty details of the PRO Act are fascinating, y'all. Like it forces employers before a union vote to share like the addresses and contact information of potential union members so that it like forces you to be allowed to organize with the data. That's one of my favorite parts, but there's a lot of really great parts. It's really important climate legislation because like the climate future we need is not one where people don't have the right to organize and don't have a voice at work, obviously. So it's fundamental. Our main comment about the PRO Act is that like we need to abolish the filibuster in order to get it passed, and like that's not a worthy thing to be in the way. Or my main, that's what I would say about it. But love the PRO Act. It's funny. That's the only piece of legislation where when I get emails from unions saying like, we want you to sign onto the PRO Act, then I respond and I'm like, I love you for asking people to sign the PRO Act. This is amazing. Every single time. It's great.
Nice. Let's see. I'm gonna go to another chat for a sec. Justine asks, what does it take to get green legislation through the Senate as opposed to the House, given the Democratic Republican margins in both? Is there any different answer to abolish the filibuster?
In terms of the margins in both, I mean, I think like the margins in both are tight, but the Senate is tighter. The Senate is like generally a more conservative body. Yeah, so I think it's yeah, I don't know what I'm trying to think if there's anything else I would say. Um, let's see. I guess here's something that I didn't mention in terms of like understanding the dynamics of the House and Senate. Like what I described was deeply about the House. Like the number of legislative staff in the Senate is like 3 or 4 or 5 times as many people as in the House. And so like there's like way more time if you're a Senate staffer to like sit down and like think through a policy and like figure out how it's going to go and like do research over time, et cetera. So I think that's sort of a useful thing to know from an advocacy standpoint. But yeah, I mean, the margins are tight as hell. Like I know as much as y'all do, just like reading, profiles of Joe Manchin and trying to figure out what the hell's going on, but that's about it.
Kind of following up on that, how how important is it which way the Biden administration leans on and where they're exerting pressure? Is that like having a big effect on Congress?
Yeah, it's crazy, y'all. Like in some ways, it's not like there's no like official reason why what Biden's doing would do that. There's not like, but the reason that like historians, I mean, there's many reasons related to white supremacy too, but the reasons that one reason that historians write about presidents have been being like the ones who make policy is because they have this enormous staff who like bring over their proposal. And Biden's having an enormous impact. I mean, when his administration like decides to move on something, like that's the moment that everyone in Congress is trying to like get their bill into this reconciliation package or make that happen. And that he's willing to spend more money and like feeling good about the fact that we just passed like way over $1 trillion in order around COVID, I think like really bodes extremely well. This is a moment that was created by activists and organizers, and the Native American vote in some places and the, Black vote in other places. But I think, um, I think it has a huge impact, and I know it has a huge impact. My God, what we have to do in a given day like shifts a lot based on what they're doing. He's giving a speech next Wednesday about Build Back Better, so we're gonna find out what the hell is going on. Like I need to keep track of what he says there, for example.
Is the expectation that they're gonna be talking big numbers, big investment? I mean, I saw you tweeted out something earlier today out of Axios that was, who knows how well sourced it is, but it was anticipating something like a $5 trillion bill coming out of Congress or something.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I also thought maybe it's irresponsible to tweet things that you're like, well, whatever. But um, I think they are thinking big. I think they're going to need pressure to think bigger to meet the moment that we're facing in terms of like, you know, mass racial injustice, immense amount of like mass murders, immense, insane climate catastrophe. And like, we really haven't made very much progress in the past few years. So I think there's going to be a big spend. I think like one of the really important pushes is going to be to see what percentage of the infrastructure package is spent on climate stuff. Because if it's the percentage that we're hearing, like there literally might just be more emissions from this package because of how much new infrastructure and like building bridges outweighs the amount spent on buying steel to build wind turbines or whatever it may be.
There's a couple of questions that are more in line with kind of like how you do your job. So Shri asks, can you speak more to your work? Does it involve speaking with advocates, actually drafting bills, or more policy research to advise a congresswoman on what to sponsor? And then Tom asks, how do you navigate researching and reading bills? Would you share with us what kind of websites and tools you use to like get the correct and good answers on different issues?
Yeah, great questions. I think, okay, so for the first question, the answer is basically yes. Like, spend a lot of time researching bills and like making recommendations of like, this is a bill that we should sign on to. People literally send out requests about like, hey, please sign on to this bill. But I also try and be proactive and be like, what is the best bill on this issue, like that the congresswoman has spoken on and she wants to be on, and go out and find it and figure out what it is. Um, and tons of groups and other offices send us stuff all the time. We spend a ton of time on hearings, where you ask them, see a member of Congress asking, um, and we spend preparing, like, working on the process of getting ready, talking to her about like what she wants to say and what kind of questions she wants to focus on. um, you know and then like I try and set aside time. A lot of times it has to be on the weekend or in the evening where I can like have a block of time and be like, okay, what are the things, like how am I going to like literally flesh out this bill that we think is like seriously missing from the space in Congress. And then like getting input from different organizations who we trust and who are like fighting the right fights, like inviting them to suggest edits on the legislation. And yeah, like in terms of talking to other offices, coordinating all the time. How are you going to, you have a friend who like you think has good politics and their boss has good politics, like what are you all doing on this, and how did you decide? um, and then yeah, talking to organizations constantly about like what's the collective strategy here. And taking tons of meetings in St. Louis, talking to advocates, hearing like what do people need in St. Louis. The amount of like racial injustice in St. Louis is like touches every possible issue, and so we're constantly trying to work on like the literally horrific things that happen there, as well as like protect people from like the state government, for example, that's currently trying to lower the minimum wage. Like, are you kidding me? That's like the type of thing that happens in the state government in Missouri. And so the congresswoman might not have official tools, but she can send a letter and be like, hey, like what the hell is going on over there? What are you guys doing? This is unbelievable. um yeah, so that's that. To the second question, um, I think it's now I'm like wondering what it's called. I think it's called the Federal Register. There's a resource where you can find all of the executive orders that I find to be like quite useful. I can double check. I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's called the Federal Register. Congress.gov is a great resource, y'all. Like you can literally like pick which Congress something was introduced in and find the bill text and find who was signed on. Another resource is I use other offices' websites, because if you have a press release, like that's one of the fastest ways to figure out which organizations have endorsed a piece of legislation. And so, go to like membersname.house.gov, for example, and they like find the press releases of like things that they were a co-sponsor of or whatever reason they put it out, and then you can figure out like who signed on to this, which members of Congress were signed on. I might see a quote from someone I know and call them and be like, yo, like, what did you think about this? So let me know, whoever asked that question, if that's like the type of resources you were thinking of, let me know. But if not, I'm happy to answer. There's many different things, obviously.
Related question from Tom. Based on your experience, what are the best ways to interact with executive branch departments like Department of Interior, Energy, et cetera? Does responding to a request for comment when a department or agency asks for input really work?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, I don't know that world of federal agencies as well. We definitely, we definitely spend a lot of time fighting with federal agencies, y'all. Like, I don't know, for people who aren't familiar, like the Manhattan Project's nuclear, like uranium purification process happened in St. Louis, and up to over 300,000 people are like thought to be affected by nuclear waste today, and that's an estimate from the CDC. Um, and like this hasn't been cleaned up, and the creek that's full of this waste like literally doesn't even have signs next to it. And they say like, oh, we don't have the authority to put up signs to say there's nuclear waste. Like, my God, like literally tape something over a political sign and say there's nuclear waste in this river. Please don't swim here, because people don't know, you know what I mean? So I think there's like really problematic stuff going on. And so the extent that, y'all comment, we send them a letter, like we all try and work together and push it along. Because a lot of times it's like an underfunded thing, or a lot of times it's like a, neoliberal like privatization, putting it out to contractors to do work and like cutting corners to try and like please fiscal hawks and stuff, So that's a long way of saying I don't know a ton about that, but like I think we should all try everything we can, because some of these things need to change.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that one, Tom. From an advocacy perspective, in my experience, it's mostly about like numbers. Environmental laws are not particularly strong in the United States, but a lot of them dedicate powers, implementation powers, to state level governments and agencies. And state level governments and agencies are a little bit more susceptible to political pressure sometimes than federal agencies. But overall, if you get like 20, 50,000 people interested in an issue or more than that, and you're good about media, a lot of times a congressperson will kind of like jump into if they're like if it's a progressive issue, will kind of jump in and sign on to that stuff. And then that pressure kind of like magically has a way of making we can't do this because the law stands in the way. Suddenly we find like a work through, and you get a permit denied or something like that on a project, or maybe somebody's actually going to take a look at an area that they need to clean up or actually do monitoring and things like that. So yeah, I'd say, there's a group in Memphis, Tennessee right now called Memphis Community Against a Pipeline. We'll be talking in a few weeks, and I think they'll tell you some stories about how they've been able to like mobilize their federal officials to put pressure on state officials and local officials to maximum effect. So there is a game from the advocacy side of playing different jurisdictions in your favor. And I don't know if you want to comment on that kind of thing any further, Saul.
Oh, that's great.
Valerie asks, what do you think of the grant structure of the Green New Deal legislation? It seems to be set up this way for earmarks. Given your background in urban planning, how can we ensure legislation such as the Green New Deal actually has the people-focused local impact the Green New Deal is looking to enact?
All right, I'm going to tread lightly here because of proprietary information reasons. We are working on That's a great question. Very biased opinion because we have similar questions about how, the Green New Deal can hit the ground in communities and are working on legislation. Um, the Congresswoman is like St. Louis doesn't have the money right now. Ferguson doesn't have the money. The places that she represents don't have the money. And so we're working on legislation right now that would address that very question around state and local funding for those types of projects, and including, not continuing the oppression by including territories, and tribes and so on. So I think, the Green New Deal is a framework and a really important one that has changed the conversation. And now, like, there needs to be specific legislation to address those types of questions that you're asking. And that's what we're trying to do, and what a lot of folks are trying to do with different Green New Deal branded or, adjacent bills.
There's also, and there's another question about kind of like what local governments are doing as well. I am looking for this article as this goes on, and I can't find it, but I saw a news item a couple weeks back about a city councilor, I think in Philadelphia, who was asking Congress to basically like let the Federal Reserve insure cities' investments in the way that they were insuring like fossil fuel investments when the industry was collapsing last March and stuff. And so I think there are some creative ways in which cities are starting to lobby through financial policy to have direct investment that's going like right there, rather than sort of like flowing through the channels of different agencies to come sometimes. So I'll see if I can find that during the chat and send it out. And there will be some sections on like local government later that we can talk in more detail about those sorts of things.
Yeah, one thing I'll add there, Nick, is we yeah, like in Missouri, we have a problem where the state tries to capture the money that and then maybe doesn't pass it through to the communities in the congresswoman's district. And so one of the things we've been looking into, and one of the things that was actually updated in the most recent state and local funding, was that, like, just how do you increase in these kinds of situations the amount of money that goes directly to cities and directly to counties, um, in order to prevent money's getting tied up at the state level. Um, that's mostly for bigger communities where it's like really obvious how you would send the money, and then smaller ones have still gone through states. But I think that's an important flag. Also, yeah, like in terms of like state and local Green New Deals, like I was doing a lot of um, research and work on like state and local Green New Deals before, and working with different, state and local politicians around like what a city and other local Green New Deals look like. And if folks are interested, I actually never published this, but I wrote this article about the history of the little New Deals. There were actually small New Deals at the state and local level during the 1930s, and they're pretty unbelievable, really interesting, and really informative for what we need to be doing now. So I don't know. Feel free to reach out. I don't know if I'm ever going to do anything with that, but I think I can also support Nick's contribution around that too.
Do you want to say anything else about that? Like what your findings were around that? What were the structures that were in place? How did they mobilize people and capital? Do you remember off the top of your head?
So back to Michael's, question about the proactive being climate policy, like the the interesting thing about these was that like the consistent thread was that it was actually like unionists taking over their city councils and just like organizing with immigrants who were being oppressed in very many cases by fossil fuel companies actually, or by like extractive industries. And so immigrants had no rights. It was in towns that had like 90% of registered voters were Republican, but like everyone else just assumed they hadn't gotten anything. They reacted to the like incessant private policing, overt racism, and like horrible labor rights, and like elected literally like musicians and electricians and like related to city council and higher offices still, around the Rust Belt. It's a fascinating story. Um, there's also really interesting, like, look at who the governors of the states of Michigan and Georgia were in the 1930s. Um, and there's some really interesting stuff there about like the way that they treated unions was fundamentally different. So I think it was very like a labor oriented moment, but definitely, as always, had like a serious racialized component and serious environmental component.
Yeah, I think there's some folks in the chat that are saying they'd really like to see that, and so would I. And I see this dynamic emerging where like the vast majority of our state legislatures are very red and very gerrymandered, and absent some kind of like massive federal reorganizing of how like our voting system works, which may or may not even touch on the state level stuff, feels like that's going to be like that for a little bit here. And so you've got kind of like federal government, which is teetering on an edge, but is moving, at least for me, way more and faster than I thought that they would on a bunch of issues, which is really pleasing. And then you've got a bunch of like urban centers, which are probably poised to do a lot, but don't really have resources. So I think, thinking about how sort of like federal and local policy can work in tandem is a really interesting area to pursue a little bit more. There's a question about uh, modern monetary theory. Feel free to answer if you want to. They said basically that we recently had a presentation on Green New Deal economics, modern monetary theory. What's your perspective on MMT and how this infrastructure package can help break out of austerity budget neutral framework?
Yeah. Like, I don't know. I think MMT is pretty interesting. Like, I think um, it's like to me, the main contribution that it makes is that like we need to stop this like time of austerity in the richest country in the world. But I think, you know, the main thought that I have about like how does this relate to like how much we're gonna get? Like the thing that's changing everything right now is COVID, in addition to movements, right? Like those two things have converged, or like a lot of people are already ready to demand more money. And I've been talking to like folks in, congressional staffers who are like, yo, like my boss is down to spend now. And this wasn't true like literally like a few months ago, even deep into COVID. But like people just saw how popular it was to actually like send money to people who need it. And we're just like, holy shit, this is pretty fun. Like, let's do this. And so I think like, yes, like modern monetary theory is like, I mean, I don't know. I won't even get into like, I have some more nuanced thoughts that I'm happy to discuss offline with folks. I mean, they're not that nuanced, but basically, I think like the main premise of it is about maintaining growth, which I think can be a serious problem in a lot of cases, but I also think it's useful. But yeah, I mean, if we're being honest, like COVID and like movements saying like just showing how like people are being killed in the streets repeatedly because of the color of their skin, um and that like communities are flooding right now while they're also on fire. Like these are the types of things that have like prepared us to capture a moment when people are more willing to spend. So hopefully we'll spend a lot of money on these things. We'll see.
Yeah, it's bringing back 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, now 12 years ago when the Obama administration came in, and it was so bizarre how they actually had a mandate to do that. And it's just like, give people things and they probably will get excited and vote for you in mass numbers. And how they just talked themselves out of that was so bizarre. And so watching that actually like dissipate for the first time in my lifetime has been really interesting. Just watching moderates be like, oh yeah, I guess it does work when you put money in people's pockets. They tend to like that. It's been really good. I'm similarly excited. I mean, it's so straightforward. It's amazing how people were able to like talk themselves out of that type of politics for so long. Who should we listen to around climate and energy politics? Like, and who do you listen to? Who are the groups that you think have their finger on the pulse in the best way, have really strong analysis, are organizing well and putting pressure on Congress to get the things that we need? Who should we be looking to?
Wow. Well, I mean, obviously, like I think Sunrise Movement and DSA Eco Socialists are doing really important work. I think there are some big green organizations that are much further left than you would think, that people don't know about. I would highlight like the Center for Biological Diversity is extremely progressive, like extremely pro labor, um, and really interesting organization. I similarly think like there's just a sort of coalition of more progressive environmental groups, um, like Food and Water Watch and 350, and Greenpeace. And this isn't, of course, an endorsement of every political thing that each of these groups do, but I think it's important to like remember that there's a whole range. So those are, um, just a few. But who do I listen to? Like I listen to people who are organizing, the like environmental justice organizers on the front lines in St. Louis, like people who are putting their bodies in front of pipelines in Minnesota. I listen to the folks at this center, the Climate Disobedience Center, who maybe too, Nick, who are just like wonderful people who are like at the forefront of nonviolent direct action. Um, so I think they're doing really important work, and the folks who are organizing like the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. Like I spend a fair amount of time like talking to Indigenous studies professors, and like folks who are like doing like research on like how do we liberate our communities, who are actually like really tying their research into communities and like trying to figure out like have their input as well as folks who are just experiencing this every day, um, and representing communities who have the least like many folks who are fighting for the city of St. Louis and the county of St. Louis and relate and that whole area, but also um, folks like the Indigenous Environmental Network in terms of organizations. In terms of read, my God, I'm not going to cite any reporters who are good, but some of them are much better than others.
How has advocacy changed since, we all moved to Zoom land all the time? Has it helped us to move more progressive, do you think, or is it neutral? Does it have a negative effect? And kind of related, how do you expect that, in-person advocacy in Congress will be, hopefully, if folks are vaccinated and after the Capitol riots and stuff like that?
It's a really good question. I was just thinking about another group that I work with a lot, which is the Climate Justice Alliance, who like groups. But the reason I bring this up is like, y'all, like groups who have been bringing the front lines, demands and like actually what people need to federal policy have like really changed the landscape in an underappreciated way. And that's really hard to do if you have limited resources. But there are groups who have been doing this. Um, and but like to that question, it's extremely different. And what I'm really nervous about going back to working in person is that right now I'm the same distance from organizers on the ground in St. Louis, but also on the ground in California, Louisiana, all the folks who we listen to. And we're trying, the congresswoman is like, listen, like we're going to do the most starting with those who have the least in St. Louis and in the district. And like, I mean, it's like really, really amazing that like I'm able to talk to EJ advocates and like labor advocates like all over the country and all over the world who have had equal access. Of course, like I miss being in person for a million reasons, but the advocacy landscape has like really given folks an opportunity to have a different type of access, and just to talk to people who are like actually experiencing the work and have like viscerally experienced the injustices that are happening every single day, on a regular basis. So what I've done is tried to like really balance it out and like have way more conversations than I would have, and like just like hearing from those kinds of organizations. And so I'm worried about that because I think it's leveled the playing field in some ways. Of course, a lot of shit doesn't happen if you never have to see people who you like wouldn't reach out to and work with in some like at some base level. Like I think that's it's created more separation and more frustration. And it's like, how do you work with Republicans who don't wear masks? Like I don't know where you go from there. That's just like I don't even know what to say about that. It's just really sad, honestly. But hopefully we'll all be vaccinated soon.
So I can't remember if we said we were going to try to go for an hour. Was that what we had talked about before?
Yeah, I probably have 5 more minutes if there's a few more questions.
Okay, if folks want to add a couple of last questions here, get them in the chat while we have Saul. He's got important congressional business to do on behalf of his district and others.
Yeah, plus I'm cooking dinner for my roommates tonight. So
What are you cooking?
Hakka noodles. You ever make Hakka noodles? Yeah,
I
so
haven't.
good. Yeah,
Yep.
it's great stuff. It's got a lot of like peppers already chopped up, so we'll do it.
Mhm.
It'll be in time. Don't worry. Um, I think I think something that I would also like to share, or be down to share with, I think a few folks asked this, but like the list that I mentioned of bills that we're working on, like I'm happy to share that with you, Nick, and have you send it out to the list, or who was here today, or it's folks who are interested, et cetera, because yeah, like we definitely are going to want support for all those, the ones that are from our office and otherwise. We're just trying to lift all ships in that way. So
Awesome. Um, yeah, folks are excited about that. I'm excited to see that. And, also I would say, Saul, thank you for the work that you put in. I know that a lot of like staffing work is not often seen, and it's really heavy, and you work really, really long hours and you burn yourself down to it. So, I'm glad that we get a chance to showcase some staffers who are actually like working really well in this world, and give us a little bit more insight. So thanks for that work that you're doing on behalf of everybody out there.
of course. Yeah, no, thanks everyone for your questions. Thanks for being interested in climate policy. Like, I work in Congress because, I want a decarbonized future, and uh, that's pretty much why I'm here. So it's fun to get to do it for someone who's like not afraid at all to stick, to be extremely courageous on these issues and say like, you know, we're not going to keep we're not going to just sit around when we have this moment when coal is still being burned in Black communities, when nuclear waste is still in communities of color, in Ferguson and Florissant and Missouri, all those kinds of things. Like it's it's pretty lucky, so grateful for all the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And for folks who are, seeing this progress, and hearing about, how things have changed in our favor since we've elected some really awesome progressive Congress people, like there's a lot of seats to win, and, we can win if we fight. So like keep pushing in your districts. Like if you've got people that are ready to go, like lift them up and help them get in there, because the thinkers like Saul and other staffers who are really pushing things, we have more numbers, we have a better chance of our bills getting passed and policy changing. So, I will definitely admit that sometimes in the last 5 years, I've been far less interested in federal policy than like local and state stuff, just because it didn't feel like much could happen at the federal level. But my cynicism has twisted a little bit here in the last 3 months, and I'm starting to get pretty optimistic about our chances in Congress finally. So keep pushing. Any last statements before you leave us for today?
um I would just say like thank you to Nick and to all the folks who organized, and also like y'all, like if you're gonna spend some time, like if you were like, I have a maximum capacity of 20 hours to spend on federal climate policy in the next 10 years, like I would spend them in the next month or two. Like now would be a good time to do it. Like this is a moment where your impact is going to go a long way. And like this is the beginning of the decade of the Green New Deal still, and like we have a lot of shit to do, and we're not in a great position if we're being honest. If you read, the regular new terrifying math articles from Bill McKibben or wherever you find your information, like we're not in a great position. It's worse than people say, and like we can't sit around and wait for markets to do what they're not going to do. Um, so just let's keep fighting together. Feel free to reach out. Like I'm a climate organizer. I happen to be doing policy, but we're bringing an organizing mentality to it. So grateful to be here. Grateful for everyone who's advocating for this stuff. And see you out there.
Thank you so much, Saul, and looking forward to seeing list of bills that you all have to support. We'll send it out to everybody else. This will be up on YouTube. I think next week we have Heather Moline, who's going to talk about utility advocacy and utility dynamics. I'll send out an email to the class about that. Thanks all. Have a great day. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll see you next week.